By 1970, the muscle car wars had been going on for 6 years. Every manufacturer had drawn their best weapons. Plymouth had the Hemi, Ford had the Boss 429, Pontiac had the Ram Air 4, Oldsmobile had the W30, Buick had the Stage 1. And then, in December 1969, Chevrolet released a car that made all of them look at the ground. The 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6. 450 horsepower, 500 pound-feet of torque, the highest factory horsepower rating General Motors had ever put on a production car, higher than the Corvette itself. And only 4,475 of them were ever built. Today, the most recent auction record for this car stands at $770,000. Set in January 2026, for a convertible, at Meekham's Kissimmee auction. The most money ever paid for a Chevelle at public auction by a significant margin. But here's the question I want to answer today, and it's the one in the title. Is the Chevelle LS6 America's most valuable muscle car? Or is it just the most expensive thing people are willing to pay for a piece of 1970? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly where it stands, and you might be surprised by the answer. Why 1970 was different. GM finally lifts the ban. To understand what made the 1970 Chevelle S454 LS6 so significant, you have to understand the rules that existed before it. For years, General Motors had an internal policy that restricted its mid-size cars, the Chevelle, the GTO, the 442, the GS, to engines no larger than 400 cubic inches. The reasoning was partly corporate politics, partly a concern about government scrutiny of GM's market dominance. Big engines were reserved for full-size cars and the Corvette. Anything in between got capped. Savvy dealers and performance-minded buyers found workarounds. COPO, Central Office Production Order, was a special order system that technically bypassed the restriction. A small number of 1969 Chevelles received 427 engines through COPO channels. But these were low-volume, dealer-arranged deals, not mainstream production options. Then, for the 1970 model year, General Motors lifted the restriction entirely. The timing was almost theatrical. By 1970, it was becoming clear that the muscle car era had a limited future. Rising insurance costs, incoming federal emissions regulations, a cultural shift away from raw power. GM's engineers seemed to understand that this was the last window, and they used it completely. Out of 634,000 Chevelles produced in 1970, roughly 62,000 buyers chose the Supersport package. Of those, 8,773 chose the 454 cubic inch engine, and of that group, only 4,475 checked the box for the LS6 option specifically. 4,475. That's less than 0.7% of total 1970 Chevelle production. And every single one of those 4,475 LS6 engines was built at the Tonawanda, New York engine plant. When those engines stopped coming off the line, that was it. No more. Ever. Inside the LS6, engineering the most powerful GM engine ever. So what exactly was the LS6? And why did it matter so much? The LS6 was not simply a bored-out version of the standard 454. It was a purpose-built performance engine, the final evolution of GM's legendary Mark IV big block family, pushed to the absolute limit of what could legally be called a street car. Start with the foundation. A 4-bolt main bearing block to handle the massive internal pressures. Forged steel crankshaft. Forged aluminum connecting rods and pistons. A solid lifter camshaft with aggressive timing, high-flow rectangular port cylinder heads, and sitting on top of all of it, an 800 cubic feet per minute Holley 4-barrel carburetor, one of the largest ever fitted to a production American car. Compression ratio, 11.25 to 1. Premium high-octane fuel required. Factory-rated output, 450 horsepower at 5,600 revolutions per minute. 500 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 revolutions per minute. To put that in perspective, the 426 Hemi, Chrysler's benchmark performance engine, was rated at 425 horsepower. The Boss 429 Ford put in the Mustang was rated at 375 horsepower. The LS6 outrated both of them, and it did it in a mid-size family car. This was also the only time in the history of General Motors that any car other than the Corvette had ever been rated higher than the flagship sports car. The 1970 Corvette with the LS5454 made 390 horsepower. The Chevelle LS6 made 450. For 1 year only, the Chevelle was the most powerful car GM made. There's a detail about the very first LS6 ever built that I find remarkable. When the pilot car came off the line at the Baltimore assembly plant on December 9, 1969, a worker wrote on the build sheet by hand, "Pilot job," and underneath that, if it had wings, it would fly. That handwritten note has been found on the car's surviving documentation. Somebody on the assembly line, on the day the first one was built, already knew what they were dealing with. On the Strip. Numbers that still shock in 2026. Let's talk about what this car actually did on the road, because the numbers are still remarkable more than 50 years later. In December 1969, Motor Trend tested the LS6 Chevelle against two of its most capable competitors, the Plymouth Roadrunner with the 446-pack and the Ford Torino Cobra with the 429. The Chevelle won decisively, 0 to 60 in 6.0 seconds flat, quarter mile in 13.8 seconds at 104 miles per hour. The Roadrunner and the Torino trailed by more than half a second in elapsed time. But Motor Trend's test used street tires and normal conditions. Hot Rod Magazine pushed harder. Their best result with an LS6 Chevelle was a quarter mile of 13.44 seconds at 108.17 miles per hour. 108 miles per hour through the traps in a production car you could order at your local Chevrolet dealer. Motor Trend didn't just focus on straight-line performance. They noted something that many LS6 owners and collectors still point to today: the chassis. Nurtured by the evolution of the Z28, they wrote, the Chevelles, even the big ones, dart like whippets through the tightest turns. That combination, brute big block power in a chassis that could actually handle, separated the LS6 from most of its competition. The Hemi cars were fast in a straight line, but required driver skill to manage. The LS6 gave you something closer to a complete performance package. In the 50 fastest production American muscle cars ever independently tested, the 1970 Chevelle SS LS6 ranks 5th overall at 13.12 seconds, behind only the ZL1 Camaro, some Cobra and Corvette 427 variants, and a road-prepped Roadrunner. In a car with a back seat, with a radio option available, in the era before modern tire technology. LS6 versus the Hemi, the debate that never ends. Now, let's address the debate that every muscle car conversation eventually arrives at: the LS6 versus the Hemi. The numbers on paper favor the LS6, 450 horsepower officially versus the Hemi's 425, 500 pound-feet of torque versus the Hemi's 490. On paper, the LS6 wins both categories. But real-world testing told a more complicated story. The 426 Hemi, when fitted in the lighter Plymouth Barracuda or Dodge Challenger, produced quarter-mile times in the low to mid-13 seconds. A 1970 Hemi Cuda, independently tested, ran 13.10 seconds at 107 miles per hour. The LS6 Chevelle, which was heavier at around 3,800 pounds, ran 13.44 in its best test. In an apples-to-apples weight comparison, the Hemi was faster on the drag strip. But here's what the pure drag strip numbers miss. The LS6 was easier to own, easier to tune, and more tractable on the street. The Hemi required specific carburation knowledge, was notoriously difficult to cold start, and had higher maintenance demands. The LS6 could be driven by almost anyone. The Hemi rewarded specialists. Motor Trend's summary captured the difference well. The LS6 was the strongest, the most super of the three cars they tested. Not the most extreme, not the most specialized, the most well-rounded. For collectors today, this debate doesn't have a financial loser. Hemi cars command higher prices at auction because of their scarcity and Mopar's intense collector following. But the LS6 Chevelle commands respect from every corner of the hobby. GM people, Mopar people, Ford people. It's one of the few cars that crosses tribal lines. My honest opinion? On the strip, the Hemi. For everything else, the LS6. Why the LS6 was a one-year wonder, and why that matters. Here's the detail that makes the LS6 Chevelle story feel almost poetic, or, depending on your perspective, tragic. The LS6 was announced as a 1971 option as well. Chevrolet intended to continue offering it. Orders were taken. Engines were even partially assembled. But by May 1971, the combination of new federal emission standards, insurance industry pressure, and GM's own internal decision to lower compression ratios across its lineup effectively killed the engine before it could go into any 1971 Chevelles. According to documented records, just 14 LS6 engines had been produced for 1971 Chevelle applications before the cancellation. Not 14 cars, 14 engines that never made it into factory cars. The 1971 LS6 did appear in the Corvette, detuned slightly, but the Chevelle chapter was closed permanently on May of 1971, with production having ended in April 1970. That's why every LS6 Chevelle that exists is a 1970. There is no 1971. There is no continuation. The supply is not just limited, it's mathematically frozen. And here's the preservation problem that makes all of this more acute. Of the 4,475 LS6 engines built, many ended up in cars that were subsequently wrecked or had their drivetrain swapped into other vehicles. Engine swaps were common in the 1970s and 1980s. Nobody thought much about pulling a 454 out of a rusting Chevelle shell and dropping it into something else. The LS6 Showcase and Registry, which maintains the most comprehensive database of surviving examples, has documented approximately 300 confirmed survivors with their original drivetrain. 300 out of 4,475. That's a survival rate of roughly 6.7%. 6.7% of the original production run survives with the matching drivetrain. Every other muscle car valuation conversation needs to be seen in the context of that number. The $770,000 record, and what the full market looks like. Let's look at what the auction market has been doing with this car, because the trajectory is one of the clearest value stories in the entire collector car world. In January 2026, at Mecum's Kissimmee auction, the largest collector car auction in the United States, a dark red 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6 convertible sold for $770,000, including the buyer's fee. This was the result of a 2-year frame-off restoration, numbers-matching drivetrain with the M22 4-speed manual, Concours-ready, factory-correct. This broke the previous all-time Chevelle record, set in May 2024 at Mecum's Indianapolis auction, where a white LS6 convertible sold for $600,000, $660,000 with fees. That car had also broken the previous record by $28,000. 5 LS6 Chevelles have now sold for more than $500,000 at public auction. Let that settle in for a moment. 5 cars, and all 5 were convertibles. For hardtop coupes, the more common body style, the market looks different but still significant. A documented, numbers-matching LS6 coupe in excellent condition has been trading in the $200,000 to $400,000 range at major auction houses. A fully restored Concours quality coupe with documentation sold for $225,500 at Barrett-Jackson, Houston in October 2022. At Mecum Indy Fall Special in September 2024, an unrestored Survivor with original family ownership sold for $396,000, below estimate, but still nearly $400,000 for a Survivor condition hardtop. The gap between hardtop and convertible values is enormous, and it reflects simple math. Chevelle experts believe only 12 to 25 convertibles were ever built with the LS6 option. Not 12 to 25,000, 12 to 25, total, ever. The registry shows 0 confirmed LS6 convertibles that have sold for under $400,000 in recent years. The floor for a verified drop top is somewhere in the $400,000 to $500,000 range. The ceiling, as of January 2026, is $770,000. And here's the broader market context. Even LS5-equipped Chevelles, the 360 horsepower version of the 454, not the LS6, have been selling for $80,000 to $150,000 in documented condition. The LS5 is the budget entry into the 1970 SS454 world, and even that floor has moved substantially in the last 5 years. Is it America's most valuable muscle car? So is the Chevelle SS454 LS6 America's most valuable muscle car. It depends on what you mean by valuable. By auction record? No. The Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible holds the top price in American muscle car history at $3.3 million. The Dodge Charger Daytona has crossed $3 million. On pure dollar terms, the LS6 Chevelle is not the most expensive. But here's what the Chevelle LS6 is that those cars are not. It's the most powerful production car General Motors ever built, in the era that defined American performance. It beat the Corvette on horsepower in its only production year. It ran competitive quarter-mile times against the Hemi and won the handling argument convincingly. And it did all of this in a car that was positioned as a mid-size family vehicle, not an exotic. The LS6 was muscle car democracy, maximum performance, accessible format, real-world package. 6% of them survived with their original drivetrain. The convertibles number in the dozens. And the market has recognized all of this with an all-time record of $770,000 set just weeks ago. Is it the most valuable American muscle car? No, but it might be the most important one. And in the collector car market, those two things tend to arrive at the same place eventually. I want to hear your take on this. LS6 Chevelle versus Hemi Cuda. If you could only own one, which one is it and why? Drop it in the comments. I read every response, and the best answers might just show up in a future video. If you're new to this channel, we break down the real history and auction data behind American muscle cars every single week. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because next week we're going to look at the Plymouth Hemi cars in detail. And I'm going to show you exactly why they command more at auction than the Chevelle, even though the numbers don't always tell the whole story. See you then.